You're listening to Podcasts with Park Rangers, a show where we bring to you stories of the national parks and historic sites from those who know them best, park rangers. Get to know each park ranger and their love for the parks as we discuss history, science, and the beauty of nature from a unique perspective. I'm your host, Lucas VK. Today we interview Katie Crowley, an interpretive park ranger, about the other-worldliness of Carlsbad Caverns.
I was never a cave person. Honestly, when I got offered this job, I thought, oh, it's a cave. I don't know how I'm gonna like this. But when you turn out those lights and you sit in the silence and the darkness, it's unlike anything else you've ever experienced. It's really true peacefulness.
It's summer in the Chihuahuan Desert of New Mexico. The temperature is a blistering 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and the arid climate evaporates even the smallest amount of moisture. Walking through this oven-like climate can easily dehydrate the unprepared, causing even a short 1-mile hike to become a treacherous task. The need for water in this climate is a necessity, nowhere to be found. Or so it seems. 750 feet below the desert, we find the steady drip of water everywhere in a place called Carlsbad Caverns. It's here we find a young teenage girl and her family visiting the national park. A shiver runs through her bones. It's a balmy 57 degrees, and she shrugs on her jacket as she walks down into the cave. She marvels as each drip of water creates wonderful cave decorations. Stalagmites, stalactites, draperies. Her imagination goes wild.
Look at that one, it looks like an elephant. What about that one? It's a giant Christmas tree.
Sometimes these formations can even look like a relative.
Mom, that one looks a bit like Uncle Al.
As she walks through the cavern, she watches as each drop of water falls from the ceiling. She wonders,
how long does it take for that drop of water to get so far down underneath the ground?
The teenager and her family leave Carlsbad Caverns, and she continues to wonder as an afternoon thunderstorm rolls across the desert. Big drops of rain fall onto the desert floor, quickly seeping into the ground. Her question goes unanswered. Many years later, this teenager, now a woman, returns with her partner and a child of their own. She remembers the wonder she had when she was a young girl and wanted her son to experience the same. As she watches the water drip from the ceiling, she remembers the question.
How long does it take for that drop of water to get so far down underneath the ground?
Little does she know that the drops she sees that day were from the very thunderstorm she witnessed on her first visit to Carlsbad Caverns. While visiting Carlsbad Caverns, one could ask a ranger these types of questions. And it's on this show that we intend to ask that very same question the woman in our story had, and so many more. Meet Katie Crowley. She's an interpretive ranger at Carlsbad Caverns.
Welcome to Carlsbad Caverns. I'm Katie Crowley.
Katie has been a ranger for 9 years. She spent 7 years in North Cascades National Park, but eventually decided she needed a change.
Washington is home for me, so it's near and dear to my heart. So lots of mountains, glaciers, scenic beauty. And then I decided I wanted to change, so I got it in Carlsbad Caverns, and it is uniquely the opposite of the North Cascades, where instead of going hundreds and thousands of feet above the Earth's surface, you get to go hundreds of feet below it, and it's like hiking underground. So there's extreme beauty here below the deserts of Carlsbad Caverns.
She's very passionate about the national parks and even writes poetry about the amazing sights she sees every day. We asked Ranger Katie to read one of her poems that captures the essence of Carlsbad Caverns.
Drip. I hold my breath, so all I can hear is cavern. Nothing else exists. Just drip, drip, drip. Before we were here, and long after we are gone, sung for eons, the cavern song.
Katie's inspirations for becoming a park ranger started in childhood.
I grew up in a family of teachers, and I always knew that I was drawn towards education, and I loved working with people. I grew up being a camp counselor and a coach of cross country and track, but I always loved being outside. And so when it came down to it, I couldn't really fathom being in a classroom education setting. I really wanted to be outside.
After college, Katie decided to volunteer with the Peace Corps. Once her volunteer stint was complete, she returned to her home state of Washington, where she felt a bit lost about what she was going to do next.
One of my very best friends was working in North Cascades National Park when I returned from being in the Peace Corps. And I was kind of at a crossroads and I didn't know exactly what to do with my life. And she said, well, come and work with me in the North Cascades. There's an environmental education position. And so I contacted the hiring official and she hired me. And that's where it all began, and I really fell in love with working in our national parks, having both my passions of education and being outdoors meet.
For Katie, the national parks have been important to her since she was a child.
I grew up going to the national parks with my family. I always went to Mount Rainier National Park every summer, and they're just, exploring our public lands has always been a part of my life. So now I get to work in them and share them with others.
That's excellent.
Yeah.
So do you feel you've found your calling?
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
We're here at Carlsbad Caverns. You've been here for 2 years, so you've gotten to experience a good bit of it. So some visitors come to Carlsbad Caverns unsure of what to expect. I know that was the case for me, because they've never been in a cave like this before, whether they've been in a cave at all, but certainly not one like this. Driving to get here is through miles of desert in what seems to be the middle of nowhere. So what draws people to Carlsbad Caverns?
Oh, I think it's just the other-worldliness of it. It's unlike anything they've ever seen. And like you said, not many people have ever been in a cave like this, or maybe ever in a cave at all before. Sometimes it's their very first experience underground. And I think it's just that draw of the unknown that brings people here.
Yeah, it does get very intriguing down there. It's a whole different world. So I'm wondering if you could describe for the listeners what it's like to be in the cavern.
Okay. So I think the best way to describe it would be starting at the beginning in the natural entrance, because that's where you enter the cavern. If you're physically able to do so and you have the time, because that is the route that the very first explorers took into the cavern. So it's this gaping opening, the natural entrance we call it, that you walk through from the light into what we call the twilight zone, where you have a little bit of light, but you're getting to the darkness, and then you're in the darkness. Now, of course, when you're traveling the trails in the cave during the day and while we're open, we have lights on for you. But it's still a darker setting than what you would experience on the surface. And there's no natural light. And we have paved trails in the cave, so you're walking on paved trails, but you get this sense of really being in the dark, because you don't have that natural light, and you have ceilings that are hundreds of feet above your head, and so the acoustics are just amazing. And we actually ask you to whisper while you're visiting, because the acoustics are amazing. But if you were there by yourself, you would be hearing your footprints or your footsteps as you're walking through the cave. You could hear just a drip of water hit the formation in front of you. If you sang, wow, it makes your heart skip a beat because the acoustics are so amazing in there. And you keep going further and further down, hundreds of feet, 750 feet actually below the surface. You reach what we call the big room. And there's a reason it's called the big room, because it is the largest cave chamber or the largest cave room in the United States. You could fit about 8 football fields within the big room. Wow. So it's huge, and in the very back of the big room, the ceiling is about 250 feet above your head. And you're looking in every direction, seeing huge formations, huge stalagmites that tower over your head. You may be seeing tiny little soda straws on the ceiling that hang. Those can be pretty fragile. They're very thin and hollow. And anywhere in between, just formations everywhere. It's very highly decorated, very scenic.
Yeah, sounds incredible.
It is incredible.
A little spooky at times.
It can be spooky at times, especially when you're there by yourself or one of the first people into the cave in the morning. But it can be a blessing too to be one of the only ones down there because of the sense of peace and solitude that you can find.
And you can break into song without disturbing anyone, right?
Especially if you're the first ranger in the cave.
Right.
Turning on the lights, then
yeah.
Yes, I do sing in the cave.
So you mentioned the natural entrance.
Yes.
And how that was how the cave was first discovered. So how were the caverns discovered?
Well, to be honest, we don't know. For the very first discoverers, we know they were American Indians. And we know they've been calling the Chihuahuan Desert around this cavern home for about 12,000 years. There is evidence of them using the area right around the cave. You can find mezcal roasting pits. So they would roast agaves, and then, so roasted agave is called mezcal, and they would use that. It's very similar. It's very similar to an artichoke, but large. So it would be like the heart of an artichoke, but imagine this big agave. So they're taking the bottom of it and roasting that, and they would eat that. But they would dig these huge pits and roast them for days. And so you can find those mezcal roasting pits all around the entrance of the cave. Now, if you imagine sitting there for days on end roasting these agave, what do you think would be eventually coming out of the cave entrance? Bats. Because we know bats have lived here for thousands and thousands of years. And so it's very likely that they saw the bats flying out of the cave. That could have been how they discovered this place. Or it's a pretty large hole. Even if they were just wandering in the desert and collecting plants, they might have stumbled upon it, because this area is known for caves. There are over 400 caves in the area. So
wow.
Because of that large hole, they could have just seen it as well. So
right.
Probably the bats or just seeing the entrance.
Okay.
But then if we fast forward to the late 1800s, right around the turn of the 19th century, there were a lot of European Americans settling in this area, ranching. And there was a young boy by the name of Jim White, and he was a ranch hand in the area. And one evening he was riding his horse on the range when he saw what he thought was a huge cloud of smoke. And he rode closer to discover that it was not a cloud of smoke, but the bats, the Brazilian free-tailed bats flying out of the mouth of Carlsbad Caverns. And that's how he discovered this cave for himself. Now, we don't know if he was one of the first, or we don't know if he was the first European American to discover the cave, but he was definitely one of them. And we are here today because of his exploration. He was one of the premier explorers of the cave. And
so he began to document.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, think back to when you were 16. Do you think that you would have been brave enough to enter a deep, dark hole by yourself with nothing more than a lantern and a ladder that you fashioned together with sticks and wire?
Not me.
Might have had something to do with his age. 16, I think I was a little braver back then, but yeah, he started to explore the cave all by himself, and then he didn't keep it a secret. He brought others down with him. And so much so that eventually, clearly people fell in love with it and realized it was a place that needed protection so that we could all visit it one day.
Yeah, Jim White's story is fascinating, and I know he's a local hero. He was young and dumb when he started exploring, but thank goodness that he did.
But
right?
but he had a lot of smarts. I've read about accounts of him just constantly looking around and paying very close attention to his surroundings. So he was very good at remembering where things were. And if you're caving, you have to come up with tricks to remember where you're going to, naming things. So a lot of the names we have in the cavern, like the big room, was named by him, or left-hand tunnel. And then cavers will also, especially in the early days, they would use rope and string and markings too.
To mark
You'll
their
find
place.
arrows in
Yeah.
places. Yeah. Yeah.
And going just by lantern light, and you mentioned how tall are these caverns at times?
Right. Yes. So with that dim of lighting, they likely wouldn't, those first explorers wouldn't have been able to tell just how high those ceilings were or how deep the abyss was below you. There's a place in the big room.
Maybe just feet in front of you.
Right. And it's a wonder that they never fell down any pits. But the bottomless pit, which you'll see walking through the big room, is you can understand when you're walking past it how someone could think it was bottomless if they were only using a lantern. And even today, when you look down it, you can't see the bottom unless you have a strong flashlight. It's only 140 feet.
So it's not bottomless.
So it's not bottomless. No, we know where it ends. However, it looks bottomless, and
Right.
especially if you just had a lantern.
Right.
Yeah.
So speaking of the cave and the formations and the size and grandeur of it, there are widely photographed. There are these fantastical formations, right, found in these caves that have been formed over millions of years. Can you talk about the process of how these formations are made?
Yeah.
With the understanding that we're not doing a geology lesson. You're not a geologist.
Good, I'm not a geologist.
Right.
But I know a little about the cave and how those formations are formed. So, but may I take a step back, because this cave is unique in the fact that it was actually created by two different acids. We have an excavator and an artist. So the excavator was sulfuric acid. Now, I'm not going to get into the details about where that came from. Scientists are still debating on where that came from, but there was a source of hydrogen sulfide gas, which at the water table, we had sulfuric acid. And that started to eat out these huge openings within this ancient reef that was left behind by sponges and algae. Back in the time, we're talking 265 million years ago.
So it's desert now, but
it's desert now, but at one point, we would be right in the middle of the Capitan Reef, and on both sides of us there would be water. But after that water evaporated, we had plate tectonics coming into play, basin and range movement. So there's a lot of geology involved.
Right.
But
this was back in Pangea days.
Well, when the reef was forming, yes. Okay. But then the cave itself was forming, 4 to 6 million years ago. And so this is when the Guadalupe Mountains, the reef is being pushed up in the Guadalupe Mountain, into the Guadalupe Mountains, and that sulfuric acid is excavating those huge chambers in the cave, just like the big room. And all other caves too in this area, or a lot of other caves in this area, I should say. So after that excavation happened, where you had the chambers being formed, then after that you had the artist, so a different acid. It's the same acid, that some of us like to drink, actually. If you like to drink soda, there's carbonic acid in there.
Ah, okay.
So,
forms the bubbles.
Yes, exactly. So that's the same thing that is forming all of the Speleothems is what we call the cave formations.
Okay.
And
Also you mentioned decorations.
Yeah, yes. Speleothems, decorations, cave formations, I'm using those interchangeably here.
Right.
So as you have surface water picking up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, from dead matter on the surface, it becomes a weak acid, and it's actually weaker than what we're drinking in our carbonated beverages, but it's still an acid nonetheless. And there's tiny cracks in the limestone that was left behind by all of the reef, those sponges and algae. And so this acid travels down through the cracks, and it redeposits the limestone. So it's essentially, dissolving little bit by little bit, and it redeposits that limestone as calcium carbonate, or what we could call calcite, in the cave, drip by drip. So it takes a very, very long time. So imagine a drip of water on the ceiling. If it stays there and that water evaporates, leaving behind the calcite on the ceiling, it's going to form either a soda straw or a stalactite. Now, if that drip of water is faster and it doesn't have time to evaporate on the ceiling, it will drip to the ground. And that's where the water will evaporate and deposit the calcite on the ground, forming a stalagmite.
Okay.
And there's lots of other formations too that are formed in different ways, but the most common formations that people are familiar with, those stalactites, which hang tightly to the ceiling.
Right.
Stalagmites that you might trip over as you're walking through the cave, that's so you can remember. Those are the most common, and those are all formed by dripping water.
Okay.
But big picture, it's water and calcite being deposited. And acid.
And acid.
Yeah.
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 A mild acid. So
A mild acid.
if you're down there and you get dripped on.
That's a common question. Yeah, people will get drips. Oh, am I okay? Like, it dripped in my eye and I didn't feel it. Like, should I go wash out my eye? No, you don't have to.
Yeah, it's
not
like
going
getting
to
a
hurt
mild
you.
soda water in
Yeah.
your eye.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
That was a long description, so
Oh, no,
that
that's
made
fine.
sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So sometimes you also get stalactites, which are tight on the ceiling, and stalagmites that meet over time.
Yes.
And those are called
Column.
a column.
You could call it a column.
Right.
Yes.
They hold up the cave for you guys. Right?
Exactly. If they weren't there, we'd have a big problem.
Kidding, of course.
Yes.
So going from there, the fantastic formations that have formed and the water that it takes over millions of years, and the fact that 500,000 people visit this park every year, what kind of impact are we having on the formations by visiting the park?
The main impact that we have is when people touch them, honestly. So it's really simple to protect this place by not touching them. And we ask all visitors to not touch those formations. It doesn't always happen. Unfortunately, on a daily basis, when we are roving in the cave and on the cave trails, we catch people touching them all the time. But when we touch them, the oil on our skin can damage them by staining them. It can also cause them to essentially become waterproofed over time if enough of our oil gets on those formations.
Kind of glaze over.
Yeah, and so it's harder then for a formation to grow, because when water drops on it, it's just going to roll right off instead of depositing the calcite onto it. But also there's crystalline structures to all these formations. So when you touch them, you disturb those structures as well.
Right.
Some of the formations can be very fragile. If you use enough force, you can break some of them as well. So that's the greatest impact that we have on the cave. And it's a really simple solution. Just don't touch them.
Right.
And that's what we rely on visitors to help us protect our national parks, and that's the simplest way that you can help protect Carlsbad Caverns.
Visiting down there and going on some of the tours, we saw evidence actually of earlier visitors before these rules, or perhaps call them guidelines, were in place. There's evidence of large sections that have actually been broken off and taken as souvenirs.
Sure.
So
Yes.
it's kind of a shame that we've lost that.
Just to put it in perspective, what took a formation thousands of years to grow can be undone in less than a minute by a visitor.
Right. Those fragile soda straws that
Yes.
you mentioned earlier.
And a lot of people ask, well, how long does it take those formations to grow? And it can vary just depending on how quickly the drips of water are happening, or the drip rate is what we would call it. So how quick the drip rate is.
The drip rate.
It's a tongue twister. Drip rate is. But there's a tunnel in the King's Palace, which is an area we take tourists on or visitors through. And that tunnel was blasted out by the Park Service about 80 years ago.
Oh,
so
wow.
you can see formations that are about as old as a human. So you have tiny little soda straws and stalactites on the top of that tunnel that are between 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 an inch long. And that's how long a human lifespan it took for each of those formations to grow.
Maybe an inch or two.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
So it takes a very, very long time.
How long does it take the water to come from the surface to within the cave to begin to form those?
A long time, yes. It depends on where you are. So there's a study that was done that showed it took about 15 to 34 years in the big room for water on the surface to make it all the way into the big room. Now that said, you still constantly have water dripping in there, but there's still water that's in the cracks in between the surface and the cave in the big room, through the limestone. So if it rains, it's going to push some of that water, existing water that's already in the limestone, down into the cave.
Right.
So when it rains here, there's still a little bit of a delay, but you will notice a slight increase in the drip rate when in August and September during the rainy season.
The rainier season in the desert, which is still not
12 inches
very
of rain
rainy.
is what we get.
So we've talked a little bit about the impact that we as humans have. We're here in the visitor center, which is more or less above some of those cave formations, and there's paving here. So I'm wondering, beyond educating the visitors, which you've already mentioned, what efforts does the Park Service take to mitigate the impact on these formations?
One of the things that was done in recent history, and I'm sorry I'm drawing a blank on the time frame, but there used to be a parking lot very close to the natural entrance. And every time it would rain, it would wash contaminants down into the cave. So that parking lot has since been removed, and native plants have been replanted there. So that's made a difference. The visitor center is right on top of the big room.
It is.
So that has impacts.
Yeah.
Something else that's really exciting that has happened in the last couple of years is the lighting system. So we went from incandescent bulbs to LEDs. And LEDs are not only, of course, energy efficient, but they decrease algae growth in the cave. And algae is not something that would be in a cave normally. It's dark. But when we introduce light and we have humans going through the cave, we get algae growth
Some of those
on the formations.
wavelengths that are similar to sun will begin to turn things green.
Yeah, and there are scientists looking at which wavelengths are the most optimal to keep algae from growing in the cave right now with the LEDs. But the neat thing about the LEDs is that you can change them.
So going from lighting to the need for darkness, let's talk about animals that are in the cave. Everyone thinks of, and a lot of the photos around here are of bats. Bats are well-known residents of Carlsbad Caverns. We know there's a bat flight program in the summers where visitors can see the bats fly out of the caves. However, we found the cave swallows, Carlsbad daytime creatures, or you guys call them the day shift.
Yeah, the day shift.
So they're really interesting. Can you tell us more about these birds?
Yeah, so the cave swallows are our day shift. They are most active, or I should say you will see them as a visitor, most active in the mornings and the evenings, because that's when they're leaving the cave and returning in the evening. During the day, they're out and about finding food. So they're exact opposite of the bats. They're going to leave in the morning, go out and find food, come back in the evening. And there's between 2,000 and 3,000 of them that nest right within the entrance of the cavern. And they really provide a soundtrack, I would say, as you're entering and exiting that natural entrance. I remember last winter, the first day they came back in February, I had forgotten how much I valued their song. And I was walking out of the entrance of the cavern when all of a sudden I heard the first cave swallows coming back. And it was just this beautiful song that I had missed all winter, and I didn't even know it. And then when it hit me, I was like, oh, it's spring. So it's just a beautiful sound when it echoes off the inside of the entrance there.
So they take off for a few months.
They do. And I honestly am not sure where they go. They're traveling south.
Right.
We know the bats go, most of the ones here are going to Mexico. But I'm not sure where those cave swallows are traveling to.
Right. On the Carlsbad Caverns Instagram, we found some of your poetry.
Oh.
And it's good stuff. We
Thank
like it.
you.
And a drawing of a cave swallow,
Yes.
which is also excellent rendition. We've seen them up close. We got the chance to catch and tag some cave swallows. So seeing your artist rendition was very cool as well.
Thanks.
It's obvious that you love your job and this park. So my question then is, when you think of Carlsbad Caverns, what does the park make you feel? What is it special to you?
It makes me feel a lot of things, but I think deep down, it's all about appreciation, that we have places like this that are a little wilder than our own backyards, that we have the opportunity to learn from and to explore and to just really take a step back and be in the present moment while we're there. Whether it's Carlsbad Caverns, the North Cascades, Acadia, wherever you go. Here particularly, I find beauty in the desert, and it's all of it. The smells when it rains, the beautiful sunsets that you can't see anywhere else because you have these open, just endless views here. So as the sun sets, you have just reds and oranges and pinks. And I also really appreciate the darkness in the cave. I was never a cave person. Honestly, when I got offered this job, I thought, oh, it's a cave. I don't know how I'm going to like this. But when you turn out those lights and you sit in the silence and the darkness, it's unlike anything else you've ever experienced. It's really true peacefulness.
It is pretty incredible.
Mm-hmm.
And on some of the tours where the lights are shut off by the ranger.
Yeah.
Highly recommend for anyone visiting. So, bigger picture from there, what's the importance of the national park system to you? And why is it important to preserve it?
Well, the importance to me, I guess I kind of touched earlier when I was trying to talk about this place, but to me, all of our national parks are one in a way because they do provide that opportunity to be here now. I think that's one of the greatest gifts that we receive when we visit our national parks, is that we can really be in these wild places or historic places and be in the present moment, but also we have the opportunity to find our own connections with these places. So it's not going to mean the same thing to everyone. You know, to one person, they may be seeking adventure. For another person, solitude. For another person, inspiration. But with these places saved and set aside for us to explore and visit, we get to find our own meanings in these places. So that's very, very powerful. And that's something that I hope that we can all value, because it's a unique opportunity that you don't find everywhere.
Wholeheartedly agree. Thank you for that.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That's great.
The perfect present. To visit our national parks is to find the perfect present. That moment in time that does not look back nor hurry ahead. A moment content, exactly here and wonderfully now. High atop a mountain or deep within a cave, where rain quenches desert and stars pierce the night. To visit our national parks is to find the perfect present. Pause, breathe, be. Exactly here and wonderfully now.
With that, we return to our story of the young girl, now a woman, and her family. She watches the water drop upon the formations in the cave and asks her son the question,
Hey, how long do you think it takes for that water drop to get from the surface all the way down into the cave?
He thinks for a moment, watching the water, and says,
I'm not sure, Mom, but it's pretty cool just to watch it drip, drip, drip.
She's content for the moment to enjoy watching her son's amusement. Then out of the corner of her eye, a ranger approaches, and she finally gets to ask her question. If you would like more details about visiting Carlsbad Caverns and more info on planning your trip, check out the show notes via the link in the description, or visit podcastwithparkrangers.com. If you enjoyed what you heard, we hope you'll subscribe to get future episodes. Stay with us through the final minutes here for a short preview of our very next episode. We like to highlight on our show ways that a typical park visitor can give back to their national parks while visiting. The Cave Swallow Banding Project is one of the longest-running banding projects in the country, started in 1982. They catch the birds, weigh them, determine sex, and if it's a bird they already banded, they mark the number. If it's not, they tag it on the leg. Initially, they were trying to figure out where the swallows go to winter, but now they can also determine longevity, sex ratios, number of young, food habits, and more. If you want to help out with the Cave Swallow Banding Project, the group is currently meeting on Friday evenings before dusk at the Visitor Center. Inquire at the info desk at the Visitor Center to find out more about how you can participate. Sarah and I volunteered for this particular project, and it was quite fun. Even though we are interviewing park rangers, we are not affiliated with the National Park Service, and any views expressed are not necessarily those of the Park Service. We're just fans of the national parks, just like you. Coming up in episode 2 of Podcasts with Park Rangers. You just heard Ranger Katie tell us she was never a cave person. We did, however, manage to find another ranger at Carlsbad Caverns that's a die-hard cave person, since the age of 7. In this next episode, we catch up with Ranger Rod Horrocks, Chief of Resource Stewardship and Science at the park. We'll talk to him about bat populations, microbe research, and cave surveying. Listen in and discover how a boyhood dream and a lifelong specialty has found its culmination in the caves of Carlsbad Caverns National Park.